بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على خاتم الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين. Assalamu alaikum, dear brothers and sisters, wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I'd like to welcome you all to another episode of the life of Prophet Muhammad. In our last episode, we gave a little bit of a prelude to the next major battle in the history of Islam, and that is the Battle of Mutah. Now, as we mentioned in our last session, this conflict basically was started when the Prophet ﷺ sent one of his companions as an emissary, and he was killed by one of the neighboring tribes who were allies of the Romans. And therefore the Battle of Mutah was instigated by the assassination of one of the Prophet's emissaries. Now, as we mentioned, the Prophet ﷺ, he mobilized his troops. He did not participate in the Battle of Mutah, nor did Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam. They remained in Medina. After all, Medina still needed leadership. Now, the Muslim army was 300 strong, and as they approached, they were 3,000 strong, and as they approached the Syrian border, they learn that the Roman army is reportedly 10,000 strong. Now, there's a lot of dispute about the numbers on the side of the Romans. So there are some estimates that put the figures at 100,000. Others say that no, it was 10,000. So the disparity is quite great in these numbers. Now, what we can infer and deduce from the data that we have is that the casualties on the side of the Muslims, according to Al-Waqidi, for example, were only 11. And this casts doubt on the size of the Roman army. I mean, if you have 10,000 soldiers against 3,000, it's really difficult to believe that there were only 11 casualties. So either the casualty number is incorrect, or the number of the soldiers on the Roman side is inaccurate. We really don't know, but chances are, if the Muslims are outnumbered 3-1, you would expect that there would be higher casualties. In any case, what is certain is that the Roman Empire was larger than the Muslims expected. And we can understand this by the reaction of the companions of the Prophet when they encountered the Roman army, because many of them were actually contemplating retreating. So, I mean, if it was an equally matched army, they would have continued, they would have advanced. But the fact that many of the companions were thinking about turning back or sending a letter to the Prophet to ask him for further instructions indicates that the Roman army was sizable. It probably wasn't 100,000 or even 10,000. These numbers are doubtful, but it was a significant army. They definitely outnumbered the Muslims. Now, although the Arabs had never seen an army of that size, especially an army that is from the Roman side, an army that represents one of the superpowers of the time, Abdullah ibn Rawaha, when he hears some of the hesitation in the words and in the tones of the companions, he dismisses any notion of retreat. And as we mentioned in our last episode, he stood and he addressed the companions of the Prophet. He addressed, that army that was heading toward the Syrian frontier. He says to them, "I swear by Allah that the very object which you are trying to avoid is the one you have set out seeking," meaning shahada, meaning martyrdom. "In our fight," he says to them, "in our fight, we don't count on number of soldiers or equipment, but rather on the faith that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has honored us with. Hasten to win either of the two, victory or martyrdom." Now, from this short speech, we understand the immense faith and conviction of the great companion of the Prophet, Abdullah ibn Rawaha. This is a man who is not only steadfast, but he is motivating and exhorting other companions to be steadfast in the face of an army that is considerably larger than their own. Ibn Ishaq, the great Muslim historian who died in 150 after the Hijrah, he reports, and again, we have the reports of Ibn Ishaq because of the seerah of Ibn Hisham. He says, فَتَعَبَّأَ لَهُمُ الْمُسْلِمُونَ. The Muslim army are preparing for battle. فَجَعَلُوا عَلَى مَيْمَنَتِهِمْ رَجُلًا مِنْ بَنِي عَذْرَةَ. The Muslims prepare for battle, and they appoint a man by the name of a man from the tribe of Bani Adra by the name of Qutbah ibn Qutada. Qutbah ibn Qutada is appointed as the commander of the right flank of the army. وَعَلَى مَيْسَرَتِهِمْ رَجُلًا مِنَ الْأَنصَارِ. And on the left wing of the army, or the left flank of the army, you have a man from the Ansar by the name of Abaya ibn Malik. Abaya ibn Malik is appointed. And it's safe to assume that Jaffer ibn Abi Talib is the one who is appointing these individuals. Now, there's a conversation that is recorded by Al-Waqidi. Again, he's also another early historian, died in 207 after the Hijrah. He quotes a conversation between Abu Huraira. So Abu Huraira is a famous companion of the Prophet. So he joins Islam quite late in the seerah of the Prophet. So obviously, he's not one of the Muhajirin. He's one of the late Ansar. And he's probably one of the most dependable narrators of hadith in the Sunni tradition. In the Shi'a tradition, the Shi'a school of thought do not hold him in high regard in terms of the accuracy and the reliability of his transmissions. Al-Waqidi, he reports, عن أبي هريرة, Abu Huraira reports this incident. قال لما رأينا المشركين في مؤتة. Abu Huraira says that when we saw the Roman army in the Battle of Mutah, we saw an army that was great in numbers, and an army that we felt that we didn't have enough to face off against. They were greater in number, in weaponry. After all, this is the Roman Empire. Their soldiers are much more seasoned. They have better fighters. They look more impressive in terms of their armor. They're wearing silk and gold. فَبَرَقَ بَصَرِي. So Abu Huraira says that I was stunned. My eyes were dazzled. They were stunned by the grandeur of the Roman army. فَقَالَ لِي ثَابِتْ ibn Arqam. So Thabit ibn Arqam, one of the companions, he says to Abu Huraira, and Thabit was one of the companions of the Prophet. He's one of the Muhajirin, and he was one of the fighters in the Battle of Badr. So he's a senior Sahabi. فقال لي ثابت ابن أقرم يا أبا هريرة ما لك. So when Thabit sees Abu Huraira, kind of stunned and bewildered, he says to him that, what's wrong with you, O Abu Huraira? كأنك ترى جموعا كثيرة. It's as though you're looking at a great army, a massive army. قلت نعم. Abu Huraira says, yes, I'm looking at an army that is much greater than I anticipated. فقال لو كنت تشهدنا في بدر. Thabit, he tells Abu Huraira that if you were only to witness us in the Battle of Badr, إنا لم ننصر بالكثرة. I wish you were there during the Battle of Badr, because in Badr we did not win because of our numbers. We were outnumbered 3-1 in the Battle of Badr. So this, one could say that this narration can indicate that the numbers, the the ratio between Muslim fighters and Roman fighters was similar to Badr. So one could argue that it was a 3-to-1 ratio. That the Roman army was 3 times larger than the Muslim. That is kind of a fair conclusion that one can make from that particular riwayah. Shaykh al-Kulayni, and again this is a Shi'i source, in Rawdatul Kafi, of course, Kitabul Kafi is one of the most important hadith collections in the Shi'i tradition, and it's divided up into 3 parts. Right, you have Usul al-Kafi, right, which focuses on history and theology and Islamic ethics, and then you have Furu' al-Kafi, which focuses on Islamic law. It contains traditions that have legal material, from the rules of Tahara all the way to the rules and the Islamic laws related to diyat, compensation and blood money. And then the final part of Kitab al-Kafi is known as Rawdatul Kafi, which is basically a collection of miscellaneous traditions. In Rawdatul Kafi, we have a narration from Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam. He says, لَمَّا الْتَقَوْا يَوْمَ مُؤْتَةٍ كان جعفر بن أبي طالب على فرس. Imam al-Sadiq says that when the Muslim forces and the Roman forces faced off on the day of Mut'ah, Jaffer ibn Abi Talib was mounted on his horse. فنزل عن فرسه. He came down from his horse. فعرقبها بالسيف. Jaffer ibn Abi Talib, he cut off the legs of his horse with his sword. فَكَانَ أَوَّلُ مَنْ عَرْقَبَ فِي الْإِسْلَامِ. And he was the first one to do this in the history of Islam. Now you might wonder, why would Ja'far ibn Abi Talib cut off the legs of his own horse? How does this make any sense? It seems that some scholars have said that he was presumably surrounded by his enemies, and to prevent the enemies from confiscating his horse and using it against the Muslim army, he saw that he wasn't able to use his horse. He's surrounded. He has to come down and fight ground-to-ground combat. And because of his fear that his horse would be taken by the enemies, he kills his horse to prevent the Romans from using his horse and further strengthening their ranks. So this was this is something that Ja'far ibn Abi Talib does on the spot. Ibn Ishaq, again, early, one of the most important historians in the early period of Islamic history. قال ابن إسحاق فقاتل وهو يقول. So as Ja'far ibn Abi Talib is fighting, again, he recites verses of poetry, and this is very common in pre-Islamic Arabia, as well as in the early history of Islam. It was a way in which fighters and warriors would introduce themselves, and they would use these lines of poetry to motivate themselves as well as the other Muslims and instill fear into the hearts of their enemies. قال ابن إسحاق فقاتل وهو يقول يا حبذا الجنة واقترابها طيبة وباردا شرابها. Ja'far ibn Abi Talib, as he's fighting, he says, how wonderful is paradise as it draws near. How pleasant and cool is its drink. وَالرُّومُ رُومُ قَدْ دَنَا عَذَابُهَا. And he says, punishment for the Byzantines is not far away. They are disbelievers, not related to us in blood. And then he continues. So as he's reciting these lines of poetry, again, he's surrounded by the Roman forces, and ultimately he is killed. Now, Ja'far ibn Abi Talib is killed in an especially cruel manner. Ibn Hisham, who died in 218 after the Hijrah, in his seerah, he says, إن جعفر ابن أبي طالب أخذ اللواء. So Ja'far, again, being the first commander of the Muslim army, again, as you recall from our last session, according to the narrations of Ahlul Bayt, Rasulullah appointed Jaffer ibn Abi Talib to be the first commander of the army. And if he is killed, the second commander would be Zayd ibn Haritha. And then the third would be Abdullah ibn Rawaha. In the Sunni tradition, and the Sunni narrations say that it was Zayd ibn Haritha that was first, and then Jaffer ibn Abi Talib, and then Abdullah ibn Rawaha. But as we said, this is probably a distortion to diminish the rank and the greatness of the Bani Hashim in the early history of Islam. And of course, this is based on a narration that we have from Imam al-Sadiq, that Ja'far ibn Abi Talib was indeed the first commander. He was the head of the Muslim army. So Ibn Hisham says Ja'far ibn Abi Talib, he took the flag, the standard, with his right hand. فَقُطِعَتْ, his right hand was severed in battle. فَأَخَذَهُ بِشِمَالِهِ فَقُطِعَتْ. Now imagine, how brave and how courageous and how steadfast Ja'far ibn Abi Talib was. He loses his arm, and you can imagine the excruciating pain, but he continues to advance. He loses his limb, he loses his arm, he holds the flag with his left hand. His left hand is severed. Now you would imagine that a soldier would have just given up at this point, would have just fallen to the ground and bled to death. Ibn Hisham says, فَاحْتَضَنَهُ بِعَضُدَيْهِ, he holds on to the flag with his forearms. His hands had been cut off, but he manages to hold on to it with his two forearms. حَتَّى قُتِلْ رَضِيَ اللَّهُ عَنْهُ. So you see that Ja'far ibn Abi Talib is doing his absolute best to ensure that the flag of Islam does not fall on the ground. Because the flag bearer has a very important responsibility. His responsibility is to fight, to guide the Muslim soldiers, but to also keep the morale of the Muslim army high. If the flag falls, it will demoralize the Muslims. So Ja'far ibn Abi Talib, he takes this role very seriously, and eventually he is killed. Now Ibn Hisham says, وَهُوَ إِبْنُ ثَلَاث وَثَلَاثِينَ سَنَةً. Ja'far ibn Abi Talib, on the day of Mut'ah, when he was martyred, according to Ibn Hisham, he was 33 years old. He was 33 years old, still, quite a young man. And of course, Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam, at this period, he is probably in his late 20s. So Ja'far ibn Abi Talib is a few years older than Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam. Al-Waqidi, again, died in 207 after the Hijrah. He reports in his Maghazi, he says, وَأَخَذَ اللِّوَاء Zayd ibn Haritha. Now after Ja'far ibn Abi Talib is slain, Zayd ibn Haritha, he takes the flag, he takes the standard. فَقَاتَلَ مَعَهُ جَمْعٌ مِّنَ النَّاسِ. A group of Muslims, they were fighting alongside Zayd ibn Haritha. وَالْمُسْلِمُونَ عَلَى صُفُوفِهِمْ. And the Muslims were maintaining their ranks and their positions in the battlefield. حَتَّى قُتِلَ زَيْدُ بْنُ حَارِثَةَ. Until Zayd is killed in battle. وَمَا قُتِلَ إِلَّا طَعْنًا بِالرُّمْحِ. Al-Waqidi even mentions how Zayd ibn Haritha was killed. He was killed with a spear. He was killed with a spear and he fell in battle. Ibn Ishaq, he narrates, وَرَوَى ابن إسحاق عَمَّنْ حَضَرَ الْغَزْوَةِ. So Ibn Ishaq, it seems that he interviewed, because again, he's 150 after the Hijrah, he interviewed during his lifetime some of those who had connections to those who attended the Battle of Mutah. So this is probably the grandsons, the children or the grandchildren of the Sahaba. So he collects all of these reports in his seerah. He reports, وَأَخَذَ الرَّايَةَ Abdullah ibn Rawaha. So the third commander who takes charge of the Muslim army in Mut'ah after the death of Jaffer ibn Abi Talib and Zayd ibn Haritha is Abdullah ibn Rawaha, the great warrior poet. And this is very interesting here. And this kind of gives you a sense as to, the rank of the Sahaba in relation to one another. Ibn Ishaq says, وَكَأَنَّهُ تَرَدَّدَ بَعْضَ التَّرَدُّدِ. Abdullah ibn Rawaha, when he sees Jaffer ibn Abi Talib slain, when he sees Zayd ibn Haritha fall, the narrations say that there was a moment of hesitation in him. It's one thing to talk about battle and one's yearning for martyrdom, but it's not easy, brothers and sisters. We have to remember that our souls, our lives are very precious to us. It's not easy to plunge and to dive into a battlefield knowing that you're going to be killed. It's easier said than done. So there is a moment of hesitation, and this shows us that, the Sahaba, even many of them, even some of the greatest companions of the Prophet, they were still human beings. They still had fears and anxieties. So there was a moment of taraddud in Abdullah ibn Rawaha. ثُمَّ قَالَ يَسْتَنزِلُ نَفْسَهُ. But as he's having this moment of fear, a moment of hesitation, he admonishes himself with some lines of poetry. He says, أَقْسَمْتُ يَا نَفْسِ. He says, I swear, O my soul. He begins to speak to himself. He says, I swear, O my soul, you shall proceed, or I will force you to proceed. So there's this internal struggle that is happening in the heart of Abdullah ibn Rawaha. Part of him wants to live, and part of him wants to die as a martyr. So he says, O my soul, you shall proceed, or I will force you to proceed. The people have gathered, the clamor has risen, but what is the matter with you? You don't want paradise? Surely what you have desired has eluded you for too long. For Allah, he's saying to himself that, O Abdullah, for a long time you've been yearning for martyrdom, and it's escaped you, battle after battle. This is your opportunity. Seize it. And then he says to himself, what are you except the drop of despised fluid put in a bag? Meaning that, why do you think that you're so valuable, that you must live? At the end of the day, your origin was a drop of semen, a drop of sperm. You're insignificant. If you want to be significant, rise up and go towards martyrdom. Of course, this is very commendable. This is very praiseworthy that Abdullah ibn Rawaha is able to tame his nafs to this degree that he removes that desire in his heart to live. He charges into the battlefield, and Abdullah ibn Rawaha is eventually slain. Now, as I said, Al-Waqidi says that there were 11 casualties. Now, of course, all of them, they are held in high regard. They are great shuhada, but definitely the most important martyrs in the Battle of Mutah were Jaffer ibn Abi Talib, Zayd ibn Haritha, and Abdullah ibn Rawaha. And what's interesting is that you see Jaffer ibn Abi Talib, there's no indication that there was any hesitation on his part. Zayd ibn Haritha, no hesitation. With Abdullah ibn Rawaha, there's a little bit of hesitation, but he's able to overcome that initial hesitation and fear. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have mercy upon all three of them, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala raise them on the Day of Judgment in the company of the great martyrs of Islam. Now you can imagine the psychology and the morale of the Muslims. In a short period, they lose their three commanders, right? These are not individuals who are, replaceable. These are some of the bravest, some of the most senior, some of the most respected companions of the Prophet. They were looked up to. So when the Muslims lose their leaders, there was a sense of panic that overcame them. And the Muslims actually start to retreat. Al-Waqidi in his Maghazi, he says, لما قتل ابن رواحة انهزم المسلمون في كل وجه أسوأ هزيمة. Waqidi, he says that after Abdullah ibn Rawaha was killed, after he was martyred, the Muslim army retreated from every side. They scattered in a very embarrassing way. Aswa hazima, in the worst way. They retreated in a way that was really unbecoming of a Muslim army. وَبَادَرَ رَجُلٌ مِنَ الْأَنصَارِ يُقَالُ لَهُ ثَابِتْ ibn Arqam. Now one of the men of the Ansar by the name of Thabit ibn Arqam, who we mentioned earlier in his discussion with Abu Hurairah. So Thabit, he basically takes hold of the flag, right? This white flag that was given initially to Ja'far, and then to Zayd, and then to Abdullah. Now the flag has no bearer, it has no carrier. Thabit ibn Arqam carries the flag. فَأَخَذَهُ وَجَعَلَ يَصِيحُ بِالْأَنصَارِ. So he grabs the flag and then he cries out, he calls out to the Ansar. Now why the Ansar? It seems that, so he was one of the Ansar, and it seems that the majority of the soldiers were from the Ansar. وَجَعَلَ يَصِيحُ بِالْأَنصَارِ إِلَيَّ أَيُّهَا النَّاسِ. He tells the Muslims, come to me, don't scatter, don't run away, come to me, rally around me. فَجَعَلَ قَلِيلٌ مِّنْهُمْ يَثُوبُونَ إِلَيْهِ وَيَجْتَمِعُونَ. Unfortunately, only a small number of the companions, they gathered around Thabit ibn Arqam. فَنَظَرَ ثَابِتْ فِيهِمْ إِلَى خَالِدْ ibn al-Walid. So Thabit ibn Arqam, he's looking at his men, he's looking at the Muslims, his soldiers, and he sees Khalid ibn al-Walid, and he calls out to Khalid ibn al-Walid. فَنَادَاهُ يَا أَبَا سُلَيْمَانَ. This is his kunya. خُذِ اللِّوَاء. So he tells to Khalid ibn al-Walid, take the flag. فَقَالَ لَهُ أَنْتَ رَجُلٌ قَدْ شَهِدْتَ بَدْرًا وَلَكَ سِنٌّ فَلَا آخِذُهُ وَأَنْتَ أَحَقُّ بِهِ. Khalid ibn al-Walid, he says that, you are one of those companions who participated in Badr. You're senior to me. You're more deserving of carrying it. But Thabit, he says to Khalid ibn al-Walid, خُذْهُ أَيُّهَا الرَّجُلِ. Take it. فَوَاللَّهِ مَا أَخَذْتُهُ إِلَّا لَكَ فَأَخَذَهُ Khalid. And so Thabit ibn Arqam, he says, the only reason why I grabbed the flag is because I was intending on passing it to you. And this is presumably because of Khalid ibn al-Walid's experience. He was a very celebrated warrior, especially during the pre-Islamic era. Of course, his father was one of the arch enemies of Islam, and he has a very, unfortunate relationship with the Muslims in general, and especially with the Ahlul Bayt. He's one of the arch enemies of the Ahlul Bayt, but nonetheless, he was known for his military prowess. He's given the banner. فَكَانَتِ الْهَزِيمَةِ. But even under his leadership, the Muslims still retreated. وَاتَّبَعَهُمُ الْمُشْرِكُونَ. And they were even chased out by the Roman army. And of course, one of the companions of the Prophet, وَجَعَلَ قُضْبَ ibn Amir, one of the companions of the Prophet, he yells out to the Muslims who are retreating, يَا قَوْمِ يُقْتَلُ الرَّجُلُ مُقْبِلًا أَحْسَنُ مِنْ أَنْ يُقْتَلَ مُدْبِرًا. One of the companions of the Prophet, he says to the Muslims who are retreating that, O Muslims, it is better to be killed facing your enemy and fighting them rather than to be killed with your back to your enemy and retreating away from them. So the Muslim army, the battle ended. It seems that the casualties were very few. And again, it's hard to tell if the 11 that Waqidi mentions are among the leaders, or is that the total casualties. This is one of the mysteries of the seerah. When you have an army that's that big, to have that few casualties, it's kind of a conundrum. In any case, the Prophet ﷺ, we have some interesting narrations where the Prophet speaks about the the casualties and those who fell in the Battle of Mutah before the army even returned. So the Prophet learned of their deaths through ilmul ghayb, through some sort of inspiration or revelation given to him by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he mourned them even before they returned. We have a narration, Aban al-Ahmar al-Bajali al-Kufi an al-Sadiq alayhi salam. He reports a narration from Imam al-Sadiq. بينا رسول الله صلى الله عليه وآله في المسجد إذ خفض له كل رفيع ورفع له كل خفيض. So Imam al-Sadiq, he says, once the messenger of God, one day the messenger of Allah was in the masjid, when every high thing was lowered for him and every low thing was raised for him. This was a sort of miracle. The Prophet ﷺ was able to see the Muslims of Mut'ah. And حتى نظر إلى جعفر عليه السلام. The Prophet ﷺ, through some vision, he was able to see Jaffer ibn Abi Talib in the middle of during the Battle of Mutah. The Prophet is in Medina. Jaffer ibn Abi Talib and the Muslims are at the Syrian frontier. The Prophet is able to see him. فقال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وآله قتل جعفر وأخذ المغص في بطنه. The Prophet صلى الله عليه وآله, as he's speaking to his companions, as the Battle of Mutah is happening in real time, the Prophet says to the Muslims that Ja'far has been killed and a severe pain struck him in his stomach, meaning that he was probably stabbed. There's an interesting book, a very famous book known as Al-Khara'ij wal-Jara'ih, and this is a book that was authored by Al-Rawandi, Qutbuddin al-Rawandi, who died in 573 after the Hijrah. And this book is one of the lengthiest and one of the most comprehensive books concerning the mu'jizat, concerning the miracles of the Prophet and the karamat of the Ahlul Bayt, the Imams of Ahlul Bayt, some of the supernatural things that they did during their lives. So Qutb al-Rawandi, in his book, he reports a narration from Jabir ibn Abdullah al-Ansari, the famous Sahabi. He says, so Jabir says, لما كان اليوم الذي وقعت فيهم حربهم مؤتة. He says, on the day that the Battle of Mutah took place, صلى النبي بنا الغداة. So the Prophet ﷺ, he prayed, he offered the morning prayer with us, and then he ascended his pulpit, ثم صعد المنبر فقال قد التقى إخوانكم مع المشركين للمحاربة. So in the morning, after the morning prayer, the Prophet sat on his pulpit in Medina, and he said to his companions that your brethren in faith, they have encountered the army of the mushrikeen, the army of the Romans. ثم أقبل يحدثنا بكرات بعضهم على بعض. The Prophet then started to speak about what was happening in real time during the battle. He would speak about the heroics of this companion and that companion. So he would speak about their advancements during the battle in real time. So the Prophet is narrating the events of Mutah until he says, أخذها Jaffer ibn Abi Talib. The Prophet says Ja'far has taken hold of the flag, وتقدم بها للحرب. So imagine this, the Prophet is narrating the events of Mutah to them while it's happening in real time. Jaffer ibn Abi Talib, he says, has taken the flag. And then the Prophet says, قد قطعت يده. The Prophet then says, one of his hands has been cut off, has been severed. And now he's carrying the flag with his left arm, and his left arm has been cut off. And then after his left arm is cut off, the Prophet says, وَقَدْ احْتَضَنَ الرَّايَةَ فِي صَدْرِهِ. The Prophet says, Ja'far is now holding the flag close to his chest with his forearms. ثُمَّ قَالَ قُتِلَ جَعْفَرْ وَسَقَطَتِ الرَّايَةِ. Then the Prophet says, Ja'far has been killed and the flag has fallen. And then And then eventually the Prophet says, Zayd ibn Haritha carries the flag, and then Abdullah ibn Rawaha. ثم قال, then the Prophet says, ثم أخذها Abdullah ibn Rawaha. The Prophet again is narrating to the companions of Medina. He says, now Abdullah ibn Rawaha has taken hold of the flag. And then the Prophet then says to them, قتل Abdullah ibn Rawaha وأخذ الراية خالد ibn al-Walid. And then the Prophet says, Abdullah ibn Rawaha has been killed, and now Khalid ibn al-Walid has taken the flag, and the Muslims are now retreating. The Muslims are now retreating. وَقَدْ قُتِلَ مِنَ الْمُشْرِكِينَ كَذَا. So this is one aspect of the Prophet's knowledge of the unseen based on these reports. The Prophet then began to recount. He informed the companions of who was killed on the side of the Roman army and who was killed on the side of the Muslim army, and he would mention the names of those who were slain during the Battle of Mutah. ثُمَّ نَزَلَ عَنِ الْمِنْبَرِ. Then the Prophet came down after he narrated the events and the details of the Battle of Mutah. The Prophet ﷺ, he came down from his pulpit and he went straight to the house of Jaffer ibn Abi Talib. فدعا عبد الله ibn Ja'far فأقعده في حجره. The Prophet ﷺ, he goes to the house of Jaffer ibn Abi Talib and he summons the son of Ja'far ibn Abi Talib, Abdullah ibn Ja'far, and he puts him in his lap, because ultimately now the children of Ja'far have become orphans. So the Prophet ﷺ, he begins consoling and offering condolences to the families of the martyrs, and he gives special attention to the family of Ja'far ibn Abi Talib. There's a narration narrated by one of our great scholars, روى البرقي في المحاسن بسنده عن الإمام الكاظم عليه السلام. So this is a narration in the book known as Al-Mahasin, reported by the great scholar Al-Barqi. The narration is from Imam Al-Kazim عليه السلام, our seventh Imam. قال لما انتهى إلى رسول الله صلى الله عليه وآله قتل جعفر ibn Abi Talib. When the Prophet was informed, when he was informed of the martyrdom of Ja'far, through that vision that he had, دخل على أسماء بنت عميس امرأة جعفر. The Prophet went to go see the wife of Ja'far ibn Abi Talib, Asma bint Umays. فقال أين بني. The Prophet says to her, where are my children? The Prophet had so much love for the children of Ja'far ibn Abi Talib that he used to call them his own children. فقال أين بني. فدعت بهم. So then she calls upon her children, her three sons, Abdullah, Aun, and Muhammad. Abdullah, Aun, and Muhammad. So they come to see the Prophet, and they were young kids. فمسح رسول الله رؤوسهم. The Prophet then began to stroke their heads. فقالت إنك تمسح رؤوسهم كأنهم أيتام. Asma, the wife of Ja'far, she says, Ya Rasulullah, you're stroking their heads as though they are orphans. The Prophet ﷺ, the narration says that he was impressed by her intelligence. So the Prophet says to her, Ya Asma, ألم تعلمي أن جعفر رضوان الله عليه استشهد. O Asma, don't you know, haven't you heard that Ja'far, may God be pleased with him, don't you know that he has been martyred? فبكت. Asma, it seems that she wasn't in the masjid when the Prophet was narrating the events. She bursts into tears. This is not easy. This is devastating news. She's just been informed that her husband, her beloved husband, has been martyred. She begins to cry. فقال لها رسول الله لا تبكي. The Prophet says to her, don't cry. فإن جبرائيل عليه السلام أخبرني أن له جناحين في الجنة من ياقوت أحمر. The Prophet ﷺ, he says to her that do not cry. Jibreel, the angel Gabriel, has revealed to me that Ja'far will be given 2 wings in paradise. And he will be able to go and to roam any part of paradise that he wishes. فقالت يا رسول الله لو جمعت الناس وأخبرتهم بفضل جعفر لا ينسى فضله. Asma, she says, Ya Rasulullah, why don't you gather the people and inform them of this, so that the merits and the virtues of Ja'far are not forgotten. And the narration says, the Prophet was very pleased with her intelligence. And this shows you, my dear brothers and sisters, that if it was pleasing for the Prophet to hear that the virtues and the merits of Ja'far are to be preserved so they are not forgotten, then why are the followers of Ahlul Bayt blamed for mentioning and recounting the virtues and the merits of the family of the Prophet, of Ali, Fatima, Hassan and Hussein, and the Imams of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam? Now there's, based on this, after the martyrdom of Jaffer ibn Abi Talib, there was a new sunnah that was established, a new recommended practice. And the narration continues and says, لما قتل جعفر ibn Abi Talib, after Ja'far ibn Abi Talib was killed, أمر رسول الله صلى الله عليه وآله فاطمة عليها السلام أن تأتي أسماء بنت عميس هي ونساؤها. The Prophet, after Ja'far ibn Abi Talib was martyred, he asks his daughter Fatima, he says, take your women folk and go to Asma, go to the house of Asma bint Umays, وَتُقِيمُ عِنْدَهَا ثَلَاثًا, and stay with her for 3 days, console her, comfort her. وَتَصْنَعْ لَهَا طَعَامًا ثَلَاثَةَ أَيَّامٍ. And the Prophet said to Fatima, go and stay with Asma, comfort her, console her, and prepare food for her family for 3 days. Allow them to grieve. Alleviate some of the burdens that they have. You know, a family that is grief-stricken, the last thing that they want to think about is preparing food. This is a kind gesture. This is an act of mercy and love towards those who've lost loved ones. فَجَرَتْ بِذَلِكَ السُنَّةِ. And this became a sunnah, that it's recommended to provide food to the family of the bereaved for 3 days. فَجَرَتْ ذَلِكَ السُنَّةِ أَن يُصْنَعَ لِأَهْلِ الْمُصِيبَةِ طَعَامُ ثَلَاثَةِ أَيَّامٍ. There's a narration in مَنْ لَا يَحْضَرُهُ الْفَقِيهِ. Again, this is one of the 4 canonical hadith collections in the Shi'a tradition. Sheikh As-Saduq, he says, أن النبي صلى الله عليه وآله لما جاءته وفاة جعفر ibn Abi Talib وزيد ibn Haritha كان إذا دخل بيته كثر بكاؤه عليهما جدا. Sheikh As-Saduq, he reports that when the Prophet came to know that Ja'far ibn Abi Talib and Zayd ibn Haritha were killed, he would go into his house and he would weep and cry profusely. He would cry very much. وَيَقُولُ كَانَا يُحَدِّثَانِ وَيُآنِسَانِ فَذَهَبَا جَمِيعًا. The Prophet says that these 2 men, Ja'far ibn Abi Talib and Zayd ibn Haritha, and Zayd ibn Haritha was the adopted son of the Prophet. The Prophet say that he cried because of how much he used to enjoy conversations with them and how they used to keep him company. So the loss of Ja'far ibn Abi Talib and Zayd ibn Haritha was a devastating blow to the Prophet ﷺ. And this shows how much he loved Zayd ibn Haritha and Jaffer ibn Abi Talib. Now the question that I like to conclude with here is, was the Battle of Mut'ah a failure or a victory? Now, the Muslim accounts of the battle differ over the result. Some early Muslim historians like Al-Waqidi, he mentions that the battle was a humiliating defeat because ultimately the Muslims retreated. There was a hazima, a complete retreat. So some say that no, the Battle of Mut'ah was a defeat. You have historians like Ibn Ishaq. Ibn Ishaq considers it to be a draw. He says that if you look at the casualties, the casualties were insignificant in terms of quantity on the side of the Muslims. And ultimately, the Romans went back to their territory. They didn't really, conquer Muslim land. The casualties were minimal. The Muslims went back to Medina. The Romans went back to their territory. And therefore, you can call it a draw. It was neutral. There was no real winner of the Battle of Mut'ah. This was the view of the likes of Ibn Ishaq. And then you have historians like Muslim ibn Uqba, who was, in his Maghazi. You have Bayhaqi. So Muslim ibn Uqba died 141 after the Hijrah. Bayhaqi, and again another historian, died in 458 after the Hijrah. And then Ibn Kathir in his Al-Kamil fi Tarikh, who died in 774, they consider it a victory. And I think all of these, it depends on which angle that you look at it. Now, from a military perspective, that yes, one could say that it is a defeat because the Muslims retreated. If you look at, casualties, yes, the casualties were insignificant from a quantitative perspective, and therefore one could say that there was no clear winner. But from a spiritual perspective, there's no doubt that the Muslims were victorious. Ultimately, they fulfilled, especially those who fought and fell as martyrs, they attained the greatest honor. And one could even argue that the Battle of Mut'ah put the Muslims on the map, on the global stage. Because prior to this, they were just fighting the other Arab tribes. Now that the Muslims faced off against the Roman Empire, the Muslims were now seen as an international phenomenon. They were now on the global stage. And that fight against the Romans gave them the experience that they would need for the future conquests that would take place and the eventual expansion of the Muslim empire into the non-Muslim lands. That concludes our discussion on the Battle of Mut'ah. Inshallah, in our next episode, we'll speak about the return of the Muslim army, and we'll speak about the events that led up to the conquering of Mecca itself. We'll go over all of those details in our next episode. Thank you so much, brothers and sisters, for tuning in once again, and I look forward to having you join us on another episode of the life of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wa alihi. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. So this was really interesting to hear about the ilm al-ghayb that the Prophet displayed. Do Sunni sources also include hadith describing this event?
Yes. So these are reports that are found in many Sunni and Shi'i hadith sources. So this is not just based on the Shi'i narrative. So it seems that there's a consensus regarding a consensus, meaning that you see these narrations in both Sunni and Shia hadith literature. Yes.
And there's a question: is this battle mentioned in the Quran?
Is this battle mentioned in the Quran? Off the top of my head, I don't think it's mentioned directly in the Quran. No.
One thing that was surprising was that there's just 11 casualties, but 3 of them were generals of the army.
Yeah.
Could you talk about this a little bit?
Yeah, again, that's one of the most perplexing things about the Battle of Mut'ah. And I haven't really found a way to kind of reconcile it. That's why I have my doubts about the number of fighters on the Roman side. I think the way that we can understand this is that the commanders. So usually in an army, in many battles, the commanders are not necessarily on the front lines. They they provide strategic guidance to their soldiers. But it seems that in this battle, the likes of Jaffer and Zayd and Abdullah ibn Rawaha, because of their passion and their faith and their zeal, they were the types of commanders who were on the front lines, and I think that explains why they were martyred. So it's not that they were sending their men into battle; they were on the front lines themselves. And the Prophet ﷺ was like this in some of the battles. So yeah, I think that's one way of explaining how the Muslims lost 3 of their commanders. It's because they weren't playing the role of kind of the traditional commander who's just giving military orders. They were active participants in the battles. In fact, they were on the front line. They were leading the charge.
So they were leading the charge, and they were holding the ulams, making them a natural target.
Exactly. So yeah, it's not always the case. So for example, even so the Prophet ﷺ in his ghazawat, so we spoke about the difference between ghazwa and sariyah. So ghazwa are those battles that the Prophet participated in. Now, the Prophet naturally is going to be the military commander. He's the general of the army. But the Prophet is not holding the flag, because the Muslims they don't want the Prophet to be an easy target. So it's not, it wouldn't be strategic for the Prophet to hold the flag. So it'd be given to someone like Ali ibn Abi Talib or some of the other companions. In the Battle of Mut'ah, the Prophet orders the flag to be held by these 3 individuals. So there are special instructions. So it's not that he didn't just leave the decision to the Muslims. He appoints specific commanders, and these commanders are the ones who are to hold the flag. And because it was such an important battle, you would imagine that the Prophet wanted his bravest and best to be the flag bearers in the Battle of Mut'ah, because this is the first battle against a formidable enemy like the Roman Empire. So it makes sense that the commanders themselves would be the flag bearers. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you. And this question, so follow up to the previous question about it being mentioned in the Quran. When the Quran mentions the victory of the Romans against the Persians and then the victory afterwards of the believers, is this not a reference to this event? And perhaps the quoting of the Quran is not correct, the person admits.
You might be right. I don't have the verses. I have to kind of check the verses if that's what is yeah, off the top of my head, I don't want to speculate. If there's another question, I can just kind of look it up really quickly. Surah Ar-Rum. Yeah, no, this is not about the Battle of Mut'ah. Yeah, this is not about the Battle of Mut'ah.
Thanks. And it's surprising that there's such a differing view on whether this battle was a failure or a victory.
Yeah. As I said, it depends on how you define victory and how you define defeat. If you're looking at it from a purely militaristic perspective, and you're only looking at how many casualties were on the Muslim side and how many casualties were on the Roman side, and you look at, okay, who was the first one to retreat, then it's natural to have these differing kind of appraisals. So I think ultimately, if you have a different, it depends on what your definition of what constitutes victory and what constitutes defeat. So you'll have some historians who are looking at Islamic history from more of a theological lens, and therefore they're going to interpret historical events through that paradigm. If you're just kind of a purely fact-based, facts on the ground, then you're going to have a different conclusion. So that's just natural based on what your standard for victory is and what your standard for defeat is.
It has a little bit of vibes of or reminiscent of the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, where everyone thought this was a defeat, but it was actually a big tactical victory.
Yes, definitely. Yes, that argument can definitely be made. Ahsant.